Good morning, everyone. This is Barbara Zarowitz, one of the faculty at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. And we're very pleased to begin the faculty office hours in about 3 minutes. So if you are chatting in the background, you may choose to mute your line until it's time to ask a question. And we'll get started with Dr. Clays in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Shah, Geeta Shah, University of Maryland, Capital Region.
Thank you so much for introducing yourself, Dr. Shah. This is Barbara Zarowitz. We're just waiting about another minute and then we will get started.
No
Thank
problem.
you so much for joining.
I just didn't want to be late, that's it.
No, you're perfect.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. For those of you just joining us, my name is Barbara Zarowitz. I'm a affiliate professor here at the University of Maryland and work closely with Dr. Clays and Dr. Brandt and the rest of the faculty on our antimicrobial stewardship program. We are very, very pleased to host your hour this morning for what we are calling faculty office hours, which is really just an opportunity to ask the faculty experts questions that you may be having, in this case around the antibiogram data and information, most of which Dr. Clays shared last week on our program. And we'll dive even further into that with Dr. Johnson here in the near future, at the beginning of March. So we welcome you. This is really an exciting way to share thoughts and ideas, to hear what your questions and concerns are, and to learn about any barriers or obstacles that you're facing, and hopefully offer some hints or tips to work through them. So as we're getting going and you're preparing your questions, let me introduce, for those of you that were not on last time, Dr. Kimberly Clays, who is Assistant Professor of Infectious Diseases here at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. She practices in the hospital in the area of infectious diseases, but has we consider her affectionately as a geriatric expert in infectious disease incognito, because she spends so much time working with us at the Lamy Center. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kim and ask Kim if you would like to make some opening comments before we start to take questions.
Thanks. Can you, Barbara, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Cool, thank you. I had to call in on my phone too, so I wanted to make sure. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. I wanted to thank everyone who was on the webinar a couple weeks ago, and the questions that we got then were really great and interactive, and I'm hoping that we can kind of continue that discussion here today. It's only been a couple weeks since then, but hopefully in that time you've had an opportunity to kind of look at where you're at with your antibiogram and how you want to use it to improve antibiotic prescribing and how you want to actually start measuring that. So I'm looking forward to helping answer any questions we have over the next hour.
Thank you, Kim. I can throw out a couple of questions that have come to us through the website, if you like, just to get things rolling, and then we will, invite others to use the chat box that's on the Zoom application, or just to speak up and offer your question or commentary to Dr. Clays or to the other faculty who are on the phone. We also have with us Dr. Emily Heel, who is a infectious disease expert as well, myself, and I believe Dr. Brandt is on the phone as well. So with that, If you don't mind, I'll start, Kim, with the first question that we got, and which is really, what are the benchmarks that facilities should be using to compare themselves or their progress or lack thereof?
So I think it kind of depends on the type of benchmark they're referring to. There are regulatory benchmarks in terms of, like we mentioned in the webinar, looking at drug resistance and incidence of C. difficile infections. In terms of intra-facility benchmarks to see if you're actually making an impact on your antibiotic use, there are metrics in terms of looking at antibiotic consumption where you can actually compare yourself over time. So you want to see whether or not you're decreasing your use of, say, fluoroquinolones. You can look at your overall consumption. There's different metrics that we went through on the webinar. The most common one would be antibiotic days of therapy. So you can look at over the year or so, or pre or post some intervention that you've made where your goal was to decrease fluoroquinolone use. You can actually look at your overall days of therapy for your facility pre and post that intervention and see whether or not you've kind of decreased your use. So benchmarking itself is a very broad term. I'm not sure if they meant like what metrics are available, or if they were meant what. Pardon?
One thing I was wondering as it relates to this, you know, so many nursing homes are benchmarked by the government, and you find that on nursinghome.gov. I'm wondering if the questioner is really focusing in on antimicrobial stewardship benchmarks that are going to be used across the country by CMS.
Oh, okay, potentially. Does anyone, Dr. Branch or Dr. Heil, are you more aware of what those individual benchmarks are going to be?
I believe that they're still investigating like the SAR, the Standardized Antibiotic Administration Ratio, and how that could potentially be used for benchmarking antibiotics across both acute care and long-term care settings. But last I heard, that's still not a requirement, and they're still working out some kinks with it. So I'm not aware of any regulatory standards at this point for benchmarking.
I would agree. This is Barbara again. The most recent version of the State Operations Manual that really went into effect on the 28th of November of 2018 really just required facilities to have a program, to have measures. They didn't delineate what the measures needed to be, and I think they're CMS is still using this year and perhaps next year to really learn, as we're all learning, what some of those best benchmarks might end up being based on experience. So I am unaware that any explicit benchmarks have been set, as Dr. Heil mentioned, by CMS. Well, maybe we should move on. The second question, could you give any advice on how to trend data if you happen to have a facility that switched to CS or CLSI breakpoints in the middle of the year if the lab switched? And then could you comment on the mistakes that can be made or are often made with antibiograms? So first, Kim, it might be good to just elaborate for everyone what is meant by switching the clinical laboratory SI breakpoints.
Yes, that's a good point. So our institutional breakpoints are usually set by the Clinical Laboratory Standards Institute. They take our look at our minimum inhibitory concentrations and determine what the bacteria are either susceptible or resistant, basically, to that antibiotic. But those breakpoints are dynamic. They do change. In fact, we just saw a change in fluoroquinolone breakpoints very recently. So they're very dynamic, kind of based on actually looking at patient outcomes and pharmacokinetics. So they can change. And so the question kind of relates to what happens when you go through that change in the middle of the year. And that goes back to looking at the development of the antibiogram itself. There is CLSI guidelines for development of antibiograms, and Dr. Johnson's going to really go into depth about that and how to actually develop those appropriately. And she's going to touch on special considerations for long-term care. So she might be a better person to ask for the next presentation. But So
Kim, if I could elaborate, as I look at it, let's assume I'm in the facility and I notice that the lab has switched the break point of fluoroquinolones. We'll pick up on your example. And that happened, let's say that happened at the beginning of the month of February, what we just passed. If I'm trending days of therapy or percent of antibiotic prescriptions that are fluoroquinolones or anything that I'm trending, I'm probably going to just continue to trend the same data, but then on my graph, I'm going to make a notation of sorts with a big star and a footnote that indicates that the fluoroquinolone breakpoint changed and by how it changed at the beginning of the month of February. From my way of thinking, it wouldn't change the data you trend or how you trend it. You just would want to make note of that, because then if you see a difference occurring in any of your metrics, you may have affected it by a switch in the breakpoint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Thank you for helping me as I really butcher answering this question. But that does make sense, because what we're doing right now is we're looking at changing breakpoints for fluoroquinolones at our institution. We actually took our antibiogram data from the previous year and applied the new breakpoints to see how it would change, to kind of anticipate how our antibiotic prescribing would change. So that's one of the things that we did, because when you make the new antibiogram moving forward, you're going to apply those new breakpoints. But it is important to note when the breakpoints change, because that can affect your actual antibiotic use. So if you are trying to trend data like that, you do want to keep track of when these significant changes happen, and if possible, kind of use an educated guess through looking at your past data, how much it would potentially change your use. So for us, we actually looked at how many isolates would have been changed from susceptible to intermediate or resistant with the new breakpoints, to get an idea of how it would affect our antibiotic prescribing. But the actual development of the antibiogram itself, when you have those changes, I'm going to leave that to Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. I guess we can take the last question that we received prior to this, and we'll review it, and then the line will open up for all of you to throw your questions at us. So some facilities use a surveillance program linked to the EMR for antimicrobial stewardship. What is your opinion about developing an antibiogram from data retrieved from the surveillance program, particularly when antimicrobial agents suppressed by the facility's microbiology department are not reflected in the data that may be causing some of the skewed results? Boy, that's a tough question.
Yes.
Is the individual who asked the question on the phone? You want to take a stab at it, Kim? We may need to break that apart.
Yeah. So I think the first part of the question is, when you have a clinical surveillance program, can you use that to develop your antibiogram? And I think the second part of the question, if I heard you properly, was how do you take into account the fact that they don't report all information? I think that's kind of the question, so it kind of depends on the situation, because if you have a clinical decision support software and you're able to get a fairly comprehensive list of culture and susceptibility data from your institution, then that would be okay. But if you're having a report from your clinical decision software that is incomplete, for either they suppress certain antibiotics, so that would very much skew your results of developing an antibiogram, or they don't provide MIC information for certain antibiotics. That could also skew your results. So I think that I would lean away from developing a antibiogram using a clinical decision support software if they were suppressing results, because you would then not be able to develop a full antibiogram, because realistically, if your microlab's still testing for them, you still have that data, and theoretically, it depends on your situation. They could be suppressing those to kind of skew people towards certain drugs, and those drugs and the drugs that they're suppressing are still on formulary. It's a very hard question to answer because it's very, very specific in terms of like how you would answer that, if that makes sense.
Yes, Kim, to me, that, first of all, it does make sense. I think you got to the heart of the question. And secondly, it speaks to the notion that some electronic health records, in an effort to support long-term care, have built programs, but to your point, if they are not reflective of the formulary or the breakpoints or the data of interest to that particular facility, in fact, it could be very misleading, and it could actually lead clinicians away from the selection of antimicrobial agents of choice based on the kind of data that are in the EHR. So it'd be great if the person who asked this question could give us the specific scenario, and we can tease out perhaps a more in-depth response. But I think at the point at which you took the question, Dr. Clay, that's absolutely right. Edna, could we open up the lines so others can jump in and ask questions of the faculty?
Yes, hi. This is Lavetta Epia. I asked that question. I don't know if I can still speak to that, because I was just listening to your comments about if I could elaborate on the background behind the question.
Yes, please, Lavetta, please.
Okay, so we use MedMind at our facility, which is an external antimicrobial surveillance program, not one that is built into the EMR. It's only linked to the EMR that we have. And so they're only able to access information that is transmitted to their system. So these masked antimicrobials that I was referring to do not transmit to their system. So for instance, for MSSA, the carbapenems may be masked. So certain drugs would of course be masked in order to encourage providers to use the less broad agents when appropriate. So they have informed us that they do not receive that information. And my team and I have been debating what to do about it. They create a really nice antibiogram. It's very detailed. You can make it unit specific. You can, manipulate it any way you want. Whereas the antimicrobial lab, through microscan, provides us the data that we have been using over the last few years for our antibiograms. And it is a little bit harder to manipulate the data to display what you want, unit specific or specimen specific wise. So we have a little bit more flexibility with the surveillance program, but then we're looking at a problem of skewed data. So it appears that the skew may be up to about 15%. And so we're just a little bit worried that that may not be what we want to do. We talked to a few other facilities who use MedMind, and one or two of them use the data just as it is through MedMind, disregarding the skewed nature of the data. And their comment was that they put a disclaimer on their antibiogram stating that the data may not be complete for XYZ reason, just so providers are aware of the problem.
Thank you. I think, yes, thank you. I think when you say skewed data, you mean like susceptibilities are like 10 to 15% different when you compare them from the data you got from the microscan to the data you got from the clinical decision support?
Exactly. So the number of isolates would be different if so the number of isolates are different, and so the percentage of susceptible isolates also will vary.
Yeah. So is it because so theoretically, and I don't really know all the details, but do you have more isolates on your one you're getting from the clinical decision support?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Compared to the microscan data, are you getting more isolate data from it's MedMind, right?
Oh no, we're getting fewer isolate data. So from microscan, you get every single thing that's tested. But then through MedMind, because some are masked, some are suppressed, you're not getting as many isolates. So the situation is fewer isolates through MedMind as opposed to more.
So the isolate itself is suppressed, not the antibiotic. Interesting. Why are they suppressed?
The antibiotic, so if for isolate 5, for instance, if there are 5 isolates for E. coli, for instance, and with 2 of them, you suppress meropenem, it would only transmit to MedMind that there are 3 isolates for E. coli, as opposed to 5, because for 2 of them, you suppress meropenem, for instance. And then whereas through microscan, it would say there are 5 isolates for E. coli.
And these are all assuming from different patients.
I'm sorry?
This is all assuming the isolates are from different patients?
Yes, from different patients. And again, they're looking at, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it sounds like a denominator issue where you might have to extrapolate the denominator to help even out that difference. Because a 10 to 15% difference, and Dr. Howell can jump in if she agrees or disagrees, but 10 to 15% difference in susceptibility is significant, and it would really make me hesitant to use that data. But you might be able to, because you said that it's basically a denominator issue where the denominator is not accurate for certain susceptibilities because it's only pulling a denominator kind of by the drug. So you might have to try a little, and I don't know if this is really the best way to do it. Again, Dr. Johnson does more with the actual building of the antibiogram, but you have to kind of adjust your denominator based off the overall number of cultures as opposed to the number reporting it. But then again, it might still be skewed. I'm not sure. But
the denominator as in the total number of isolates, if you have total susceptible isolates over total isolates. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes, as opposed to the number that were reported. But then again, it probably skews it maybe the other way. I'm not sure. It's
right.
10 to 15, you know what I mean? Like you could try that, but it might end up skewing it the opposite way because now your denominator is bigger. But a 10 to 15% difference is fairly significant because we only think about, like when you think about HAP and VAP, which, you know, long-term care doesn't, but the guidelines say consider adding therapy when you've got more than 10% resistance. So a 10 to 15% is significant in terms of decision making.
Right. Okay. We just wanted to get your opinion of, you know, what you think we should do. And 10 to 15% was just based on a quick sample check of just a couple of the drugs. With one system, it might be 86%. With the other system, it was more like 76%. We did notice that difference, and we instead of going through and doing the whole document, we just figured we'll take a step back, considering how much time needs to be invested. We just thought we'd take a step back and decide which route to go, and then go with it. Doing some research as to what other people are doing, how others are handling the same problem.
So, Emily, would you like to add to the discussion, or anyone else on the phone? Would you like to?
I'm not sure I have anything to add beyond what Dr. Clays has mentioned. As she said, some of the nitty-gritty behind the actual building of the antibiogram is really handled best by Dr. Johnson, who will be available on subsequent calls to answer these types of questions. Unfortunately, we do more of the front-end interpretation and less of the back-end building of it, so I would have to defer to her on that.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Shah, do you have questions? I heard you speak so affirmatively at the beginning. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah, so I'm working with Lavetta, and I think our microbiologist, Harjinder, must be on the phone also. All these years we had been doing antibiogram, only one for the hospital, general, not unit specific. We have never done that. Also, we do once a year, and it is done by microscan. We try to stick to the criteria of having minimum 30 samples, but occasionally in certain condition we have less than 30, but we end up to put that on the antibiogram also, because even though if it shows, as for example, Salmonella or Shigella, it shows resistant to rocephin or quinolone, we want physician to be aware of. However, this year, as Lavetta mentioned in detail, we are trying to compare between the main reason she's looking, or we are looking, is because it may provide unit specific, mainly the critical care area, and we might help the physician better. But I think we are in the beginning stage and learning stage, and I think MedMind gives the data, but we need to understand before we put out in the hospital. We need to make sure we are giving the correct or near reasonably correct information to the provider. And so between Microscan and MedMind, we are trying to make one antibiogram by next month.
That makes sense. And I don't envy you the quandary, because it may end up being that you sit down with the microbiologists from both companies and have a discussion to really understand how they would advise you. But yeah, that's a tough situation for you.
But I think it is in learning stage, as Lavetta had a lot of questions, and we have a lot of questions. We are doing our homework, and hopefully it looks like we are one of the first one in the area trying to look into this, but it's a work in progress, and we thought we should present here, and Lavetta did, for rightfully. So we'll continue to talk to you as we move forward.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Other questions? You can use the chat box if you're shy, or you can just speak on the call. Except I'm hearing what almost sounds like a vacuum cleaner or something. There may be a line that you could mute. How many of you tried, in follow-up to Dr. Clays's lecture on February 6th, how many of you tried to develop some metrics following that to begin your own measures? Maybe I could ask you to share some of your experiences around that. But someone who's either near a toilet or near a vacuum cleaner, please mute your line. Anything? No? Other questions? Well, this is great. Under the circumstances, if there's no further dialogue or questions, we don't need to prolong the faculty hours. We're here to help you, and if there are no other issues. Kim, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if there's no other questions, especially about metrics, because I can speak to the other, I can't really speak to the development of the antibiogram as much. That's more Dr. Johnson's realm, but I can speak to being the end user and how to measure the effects of it. That's really where I could help out. But if there's no other questions, then I agree. There's no point in us all sitting in awkward silence in our office.
Okay. Well, listen, we collectively thank you very much for calling in. These were great questions. We will revisit a couple of these questions for sure following the next webinar. And we wish you continued success as you apply the learnings of your experiences and share them. And we hope to hear back from you again soon. And with that, I guess we will terminate the call. And have a great day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.